Hello, and welcome to the Poison Paint Factory. My factory designated name is Poison226. Nice to meet you. Spawn was once a man. He died and came back from hell. He is hell spawned. But does that make him a monster? Just because he's no longer human, does that mean there's no place for him in this world? As Spawn struggles to regain his memories and find acceptance in his new life, there are those who would seek to destroy him. Join me today as we explore the story of Al Simmons. Spawn, or Al Simmons as he was known, had a good life with his wife Wanda and was a model soldier, attaining the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the US Marine Corps. He later joined the US Secret Service and later still the CIA. Under the directorship of Jason Wynn, Al was eventually recruited into the Special Ops Division known as the US Security Group, whose main directive was to protect the country against all domestic and foreign threats. The future was looking good for Al, but things were about to take a turn. If you play with fire, you'll get burned. Al made it known to Wynn that he was planning on resigning from his job, which didn't go well with the boss. On his final mission, Al was murdered by a fellow mercenary.
He had 1 day left till retirement.
Depending on which continuity you want to follow, it was either this guy, Bruce Stinson, codenamed Chapel, or this gal, Jessica Priest. Spawn doesn't remember who killed him, but in the mainline comic series, the mystery was solved in issues 12 and 13. Chapel was Al's killer. However, due to copyright issues, when the live-action movie was made, they changed this to Jessica Priest. This version of events was made canon from issue 61 of the comics, and became accepted continuity from then on. It's worth noting that the Spawn comic doesn't open with this backstory. The reader, alongside Spawn himself, has to uncover all this piece by piece. Issue 1 of the Spawn comic actually starts after Al Simmons' death, and once he's already come back to Earth as Spawn. But how did Al become Spawn? Although this story is slowly uncovered throughout the series, I'm going to include a brief explanation here. We know that Al was a good man. He loved his wife and his country, so much so that he was prepared to and did kill people. He did this believing it was for the greater good. But hell does not discriminate, and when Al died, he found himself in the fiery depths where the demon Malbosia was waiting with open arms. Malbosia is one of the most powerful rulers of hell. In effect, he's Grand Master, and often thought as Satan in the Spawn books. He resides in the 8th Circle, if you fancy a visit. Once Al Simmons is cast at the feet of Malbosia, he is offered a deal. Al will be returned to Earth to see his wife one last time, but in exchange, Al must lead the armies of Hell for Malbosia as his latest general, his latest Hell Spawn. Al accepts the deal and is transported back to Earth as promised. Unfortunately, demons in the Spawn universe respect verbal contracts about as much as in any other media. There's a little twist that Al wasn't made aware of. He was held without his knowledge for 5 years and his memories in tattered or missing entirely. And this is the exact moment we join Spawn, when we open the first page of the first comic. Disclaimer, please remember that Spawn was never created as a child-friendly property. There'll be some distressing themes and imagery ahead. The full cut of the animated show, which is very close representation of the comic, is definitely not suitable for children. There is a separate PG-13 version of the animated show, and the 97 live-action movie is also PG-13. As we are discussing the comic, however, there are things that may not be suitable for younger viewers. Oh, and of course, spoiler warning. I don't belong here. Not here. Not now. I have to get back there. The bet was rigged. He made me believe. Now there's darkness in my soul. I want to die again. Page 1 and our hero is already dead and wants to die for a second time. He is dazed and confused, full of conflicting emotions, and he has no idea who he is, let alone where he is or why he's there. But I chose to come back. Why? What an opening, let's go. We are then hit with an interesting information dump in the form of 3 newsreaders. One is factual and seemingly unbiased. One is more of a conspiracy theorist who tends to fill in the information blanks with his own opinions and potential falsehoods, and to round off the trio, the final news anchor is more of a gossiping fashionista than a true reporter. These 3 characters come back from time to time to help give the readers a sense of the bigger picture of the story, which I find quite an interesting method to go beyond the main character's eyes and help fill in some of those blanks. Al Simmons, now known as Spawn, becomes aware he was lied to. He feels a great power inside himself, but he doesn't remember anything substantial, not even his wife's name, so he decides that if he can find her, she'll be able to help him. She'll know who he is. At this time, we are also introduced to Spawn's power tracker, starting on 9999, and on the following page there's a wonderful 2-page spread showing Spawn off in all his glory for the first time. Sandberg and Maximilian Steve Percival, Twitch Williams III, more commonly known as Detectives Sam and Twitch, make their first appearance in issue 1. Sam is an old school, rough and ready kind of guy, who draws his gun first and asks questions later. He has his own kind of moral code, which he sticks to without fail. He might be rough and bullish, but he is honest and straight as an arrow, which is a trait hard to find with the other police in this book. Sam's right-hand man Twitch would be the Deadwood if this was a comedy duo. Think Dave Lister to Rimmer in Red Dwarf, or Simon Pegg to Nick Frost in the Cornetto trilogy. He's the brains, he's the calm to Sam's impulsiveness, he's the little guy with the crack shot. What comes to mind when I think of Twitch is his wit and Mortician's humour. He can say some of the funniest dark humour in comics, and it seems to fly over Sam's head. He often seems to mock Sam, who he refers to as Sir, with his signature dry wit, but it seems to come from a place of friendship, like brotherly banter, rather than actually trying to put him down. As issue 1 continues, you get a sense of the world Spawn inhabits. You know he's lost and confused, he made a deal but got burnt, pun not intended, and resents what cards he's now been dealt. You've met some of the locals in the form of the detectives and the news reporters, and now you are shown the dirty laundry of the town, the marauding gangs who prey upon a lone woman. Thankfully, Spawn is there to save her, but his memories well up again and overflow. He remembers his own funeral and watching his wife suffer as he's lowered into the ground. He shows his vulnerable side. The woman he just saved, who was so afraid of him moments ago, now holds him in a caring embrace like a mother comforting a child after a nightmare. It's a lovely moment in the book, showing that Spawn's human side does still exist. In the final few pages, Spawn removes his mask, exposing his burnt face, and now his power counter is reduced to 9995 after he used some magic to save the woman. The counter changing shows that his magic is finite, but what will happen when it reaches 0? On the very last page, Malbosia is shown warning Spawn that his troubles have just begun, while we are teased that the next issue will feature the Violator. What a fantastic first issue. It has so much to do in such a limited page count, and I feel it really does a great job of world building, introducing the main and supporting characters, and giving you an insight into the bigger picture of the story. I appreciate that some readers may find the first issue does a whole load of nothing, and that's kind of understandable. There's no big villains like we're used to in comic books, well, other than Malbosia, who is a more distant antagonist at this point, and having no big blockbuster fights, just some street level thugs. It feels like a bit of a letdown, but I feel that it's a great way of giving the character a chance to breathe and find his feet a little. You know, give him a break. He's just been to hell and back. Issue 2 is where it really kicks off. Clown, aka the Violator, is introduced. Literally in the first page of this issue, he is absolutely perfect. This little pudgy guy is like an evil Danny DeVito. He's funny and he looks like he's no threat to anyone, but if he feels the need he can transform into his true form, a spindly demon with a giant head and a gaping jaw full of teeth. That's the Clown, not Danny DeVito. He is such a great antagonist to Spawn in all forms of media. If you ever get chance, check out the Spawn live action movie from '97. I loved this movie, but it's very much of its time. John Leguizamo, also known for playing Luigi in Sid the Sloth, was brilliant in the role of Clown, playing the character as loud and obnoxious. In the animated series, he was voiced by Michael Nicolosi in his human form and by James Haynes in his demonic form. In this version of the Spawn mythos, he is portrayed as menacing but with a softer, whispering voice. Anyway, back to the comic, and the Violator is introduced in his clown form, talking to an alley cat, telling it all the ways it was going to make Spawn hurt, while Spawn is trying to figure out who he is and what's happened to him. Then we see a mobster running towards where his boss's screams are coming from, and a long, thin, grey arm bursts through the door, gripping him by the face before ripping out his heart. What an introduction to the Violator's demon form. After being back on Earth for 2 days, Spawn decides to try out his new powers to change his appearance, to see if he could look normal again. Unfortunately, Malboja has already anticipated this, so instead of looking like Al Simmons, who was a black man, he turns into a white blonde-haired stranger. Also, Spawn gets another flashback and remembers his old boss, Jason Wynn. Jason is power-hungry, he revels in others' pain, and Al, back when he was alive, began to suspect him for involvement in cover-ups and other shady dealings. As a symbolic human devil, Jason represents all that is wrong with mankind. He's a perfect antagonist to Spawn, using his money, power, and connections to give himself the upper hand. He might not be a physical threat, but he is the biggest thorn in Spawn's side, for a human at least. Jason was played by Martin Sheen in the '97 live-action movie, and voiced by John Lee in the animated series. We'll be coming back to Jason in the comic shortly, so stick a pin in that for now. After these memories, Spawn falls from the roof of a church, and his power meter now shows 9432. All the while, Violator has been killing mobsters, leaving a trail of bodies with their hearts ripped from their chests. It's at this point that Spawn finally meets the Violator in his clown form. I'm going to call him Clown when he's in this form from now on. Clown tells Al that his new name is Spawn and starts threatening him. Spawn just walks away, but while Spawn's back is turned, Clown changes into his demonic form, which I will now refer to as Violator. And the issue ends with a great full panel of them both, as Violator prepares to attack Spawn from behind. So, jumping in on issue 3, Spawn remembers his wife's name, Wanda Blake. She is actually named after Todd's real-life wife with the same name, so that's nice. Al finds out where she lives and transformed into his human form again, and decides to pay her a visit. Before he is able to tell her who he is, a little girl runs to the door. This is Wanda's daughter, Cyan, named after Todd's real-life daughter of the same name. Also nice. This comes as a big shock to Al, as they weren't able to have children. He passes out and eventually is woken by his best friend Terry Fitzgerald, who is now the current husband of Wanda. Still with me? Good. Spawn and Violator have their first battle, which is masterfully underwhelming. Well, in issue 3 anyway. Without Spawn throwing a single punch, Violator plucks Spawn's heart from his chest as if it was nothing. Believing the hero defeated, he goes to leave, but Spawn pops back up, and then all hell breaks loose. According to the comic anyway. In issue 4, Spawn heals what would have been a mortal wound, his power meter showing that he's exhausting his power at an alarming rate, but now it's payback time. He hits Violator with a fire blast from his hands, but he just shrugs it off while telling Spawn that he's there to keep him in check. He is there to make sure that he doesn't stray off the path set for him. They continue to fight, dismembering each other until Malboja himself puts a stop to it. Malboja talks at length about his plan to gather souls and amass a massive army to war against Heaven with, telling Spawn each time he uses his powers, they are depleted. And, once he has used the last of them, he will have a second death, to which Malboja will own his soul. Okay, still with me? I thought it was important to give you a bit of a blow-by-blow of the first story arc, as it really sets the stage for the greater story. From this point on, I'm going to just hit the main beats. As I've said before, Spawn has a lot of story and lore, but it really likes to take its time to get to the big moments. That's why I wanted to cover the first 32 issues. Obviously, if there's anything you think I've forgotten to mention, please feel free to drop it in the comments. Villains, 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 villains. All good heroes need great bad guys. Would Batman be as popular if it weren't for the Joker? What about Wolverine without Sabretooth? Or Spider-Man and the Green Goblin? Or Spider-Man and the Sinister Six? Or Spider-Man and Venom? Man, Spider-Man has some great villains. Well, Spawn is no different. If the first couple of issues were setting up the story and introducing Spawn as a character, the next bunch of issues were like intertwined monsters of the week. We had Billy Kincaid, a protected child murderer, who took on the appearance of an ice cream man to lure in victims. He dies at the end of the issue, being hung by chains to the ceiling, impaled by ice cream scoops and sticks, left for the police to find with the famous notes, "Boys screamed and girls screamed, so I made him scream and scream and scream." Next up is Overt Kill. He's a one-man wrecking crew, a mafia enforcer, a cyborg who is more machine than man. He's sent after Spawn at the behest of Tony Twist, more on him later, and is almost successful if it weren't for Spawn's ability to teleport to safety. Ultimately, Overt Kill is obliterated in the next issue when Spawn steals a small army's worth of military weapons from his good friends the United States Security Group. There's Antonio Carlo Twistinelli, who's a wealthy crime lord in the Spawn universe who often gets involved in various plans to destroy Spawn. He's better known as Tony Twist, not to be confused with Anthony Rory Twist, a professional ice hockey player in the NHL, who funnily enough was a much feared enforcer. The reason I bring this up is because the real-life Tony Twist found out about Spawn at some point in 1997 and didn't exactly like how his name was being used. Between 2000 and 2007 there were rulings and reversals until it was finally settled out of court in 2007 to the sum of $5 million. In 2020, Twist reflected on the lawsuit in an interview saying, "I did not despise Todd in any way, shape or form, not at all. He thought this was a First Amendment issue where he had the right to do whatever." The character Tony Twist is in no way a representation of the real-life Tony Twist, in appearance or personality, or history. I think it was meant to be an in-joke, as McFarlane's a big ice hockey fan, and for the first time ever he didn't have editors breathing down his neck telling him it was a bad idea. And that's the story of Tony Twist. And the first lawsuit we're going to cover today. Back to the villains. We've talked a lot about the demons of hell and the wickedness of men, but what about heaven? Can you have villains from heaven? You can't really have hell without heaven, right? And the Spawn universe is no exception. Heaven might have angels, but they can be villains, you know. It's a matter of perspective. This leads us to Angela. Angela is a Spawn-hunting angel who shows her deceptive side from her very first panel. Angela's inaugural issue is set in the medieval period, with a young woman crying and begging for help. Spawn, not our current day Spawn, let's call him medieval Spawn, yeah, comes to her aid in his shining black and red armour, chains and flowing cape. She gets him to lower his guard and then unveils her true form, an angel with red hair like a comet, pupilless white eyes with black markings around them, and golden armour, if you could call it that. Angela is shown to be very capable at hand-to-hand combat, quickly dispatching medieval Spawn, and now, 800 years later, she is still inhabiting Earth, hunting down the new Hellspawn. Angela was created by Neil Gaiman. He was a guest writer for issue 9, which is where Angela was first introduced. She was such a popular character that she went on to star in her own self-titled miniseries. Not only did Gaiman create Angela, but he also introduced Spawn's mentor, Count Nicholas Cagliostro. I know there are people out there cracking their knuckles and preparing to correct me here. Cagliostro? Mr. Poison, don't you mean Cogliostro? Nope, it's official, that's how he introduces himself in the book, but I'm going to refer to him as Cog from now on. Interestingly enough, the real name Cagliostro, aka Giuseppe Balsamo, was an Italian magician who lived between 1743 and 1795. His reputation started well with him being associated with the royal courts of Europe, but over time his reputation deteriorated as he was marred by scandal and became regarded as a charlatan and fraud. Foreshadowing? Cog resembles a homeless old man with a long white beard to go with his long green robe. He helps Spawn focus his powers and use them more efficiently. When they meet, Cog knew Spawn was formerly Al Simmons. He knew what the costume can do and many other secrets. Cog is probably one of the most interesting characters in the Spawn mythos to me. He becomes integral to the main story. Well, I won't spoil that here. So, Angela, Medieval Spawn and Cog were all introduced in issue 9, and they're all Neil Gaiman original creations, which unfortunately brings us to lawsuit number 2. Gaiman took McFarlane to court in 2002 as he had written issue 9 and 26 of Spawn and the 3-issue miniseries called Angela, and was joint copyright holder of the Medieval Spawn, Angela and Cog characters. But give it a second, here's the messy bit. McFarlane continued to use these characters without the input of Gaiman and without paying him royalties for using them, initially stating that the agreement was that Gaiman had worked for hire and had no right to the characters. Gaiman refuted this and stated what McFarlane had done had violated their verbal contract. McFarlane wanted to continue using these characters and Gaiman wanted to continue his run on the Marvel Man comic that had been discontinued before its conclusion, so they made a deal. McFarlane and Gaiman signed a contract in 1997 where McFarlane would trade his rights for Marvel Man in exchange for Gaiman's rights to the Spawn characters in dispute. The problem was that Todd had only got the rights to 2 trademarks for logos, and not the actual character Marvel Man. Obviously, when Gaiman found out about this, he was upset and started a lengthy legal battle to get recompense for loss of earnings. On top of this, Gaiman took McFarlane to task over 3 characters used in the 1999 crossover series Spawn: The Dark Ages. Gaiman testified that he believed the Dark Ages Spawn equivalent to medieval Spawn, and the angels Domina and Tiffany, the Dark Ages equivalent to Angela, were imitations of his past creations, which the judge ruled in Gaiman's favour. After a 10-year battle concluding in 2012, an agreement was met where Gaiman was acknowledged as co-owner of Spawn issue 9 and 26, as well as all issues of the Angela miniseries. The parties also agreed to dismiss all pending claims and bear their respective attorneys' fees and costs. I'm not sure of the exact settlement between the 2 parties, but you may have noticed Angela popping up from time to time in the Marvel universe, as she is now canonically Thor's big sister. I thought it was pretty interesting. Her aesthetic fits in nicely with the other pseudo-Norse gods, but only time will tell how much of an impact she will have on the greater Marvel universe. This lawsuit reminds us that there's a bit of a grey area that is not exclusive to comics. The crossroads where a character's background, personality and likeness meet, well, who actually owns what? And what actually makes that character who they are? In this case, Gaiman sold his rights over Angela to Marvel, and they are using her likeness in the comics, but ignoring her original origin. Is the Angela in Marvel really the same Angela? What makes Angela who she is, and what was intended to be? I would be curious to know your thoughts on the subject. So, we're only on issue 9 of Spawn, and we've already discussed 2 lawsuits, but despite this, Spawn as a comic is still alive and kicking. Turns out even Al Simmons isn't safe from lawsuits. Back in 2012, McFarlane sued a man named Al Simmons. And this wasn't just any Al Simmons, this was his friend, a man who he had employed, a man whose name he had used with consent for the main character of his first ever independent comic book. And the reason for this lawsuit? The living, breathing Al Simmons had published a book called The Art of Being Spawn, where he insinuated that not only his name had been lent to the character Al Simmons, but also parts of his own life had been incorporated into the character's story. Several times Simmons had spoken to McFarlane about his book while he worked on it, and several times McFarlane had told him to be careful and only publish factual information, including that of McFarlane's company. Unfortunately, when the book was released, McFarlane felt that it breached their agreement as it damaged his reputation and goodwill and the misrepresentation of company secrets. Simmons stated on the cover of his book, with contributions of Spawn creator Todd McFarlane, which was blatantly false, and to top it all off, charges included trademark and copyright infringement, which is a statement I'm just going to leave hanging there. Yep. Anyway, the 2 came to an agreement that ended the lawsuit back in 2012, perhaps making it the shortest lawsuit McFarlane has had, although he had some practice by this point. Back to Spawn. Some of you might know about issue 10 already, but there are some misconceptions I'd like to clear up. Dave Sim. You might remember from the first video that Dave Sim was a guest writer for issue 10 of Spawn. He's also known for his independent comic Cerebus and his support for creators' rights. Remember this, it is important. After its initial release, the issue wasn't put in print again for a long time. No further single issues, no appearance in any collected editions of Spawn, nothing. Why? A bad joke. If you've read issue 10, something that may spring to mind is the image of a bunch of men with hoods over their heads tied with nooses and their hands bound behind their backs. These men are artists, more specifically, comic book artists. Do you get it? This must have been incredibly cathartic for Todd to draw something so true to his situation, resonating with his anarchic position at the time. How about the Violator dressed as Lady Justice, or maybe The Shot? You know, the one where the whole page is dedicated to dozens of heroes and villains, their arms outstretched towards Spawn, pleading for freedom through the iron-barred cage. As we know who owns these characters, using their likeness is a risky game to play, as a lot of the arms featured in this particular image were very recognisable. Needless to say, a lot of people thought Dave and Todd had pushed things a little too far in terms of fair use, and told them never to reprint the issue again due to copyright of said appendages. But this wasn't actually the reason why issue 10 stopped being printed. When I say it was due to a bad joke, I wasn't joking. The real situation is Todd asked Dave Sim to write an issue of Spawn, which he gratefully accepted. It's daring and political, as was Dave's style, but Todd turned it down, saying he can't use it, and asked Dave to write another. After being given carte blanche to write whatever he wanted, Spawn being sat on the toilet for 22 issues was brought up as an example of the level of freedom he was being given, and Dave is obviously frustrated and tells Todd that's the only one you're getting, which Todd relents, and the issue is published as it was written. Now Dave felt like he owed Todd for letting his script pass, so 3 years later when the opportunity arose, he deadpan jokes to one of the higher-ups at Image Comics to tell Todd that, in his words, "If he ever tries to reprint Spawn 10 without asking me, I'll take him down. I'll go to the mat over it." Basically, he was trying to push Todd to call his bluff so that he could relent and allow Todd to republish his issue, and the favour for printing it in the first instance would be repaid. But that's not how it was taken. It was taken seriously. Dead seriously. So in Dave's words, "I had intended it as the, yeah listen I can't use it equivalent in terms of unsettling the other guy. Of course the years went by, it got a little out of hand. I had figured he would see through it before too long, remembering that the core element of my creator's rights philosophy had always been that if you worked on it, you had the right to reprint it. I was sure they would just pass along the message but then go, hey, wait a minute, and call me or send a letter, but that's not what happened. The point of this joke was to rebalance the scales, so to speak, and repay the debt that he felt he owed Todd. He never intended on stopping the issue being reprinted, but Todd had obviously forgotten that Dave Sim was an outspoken individual when it comes to the reciprocal licensing agreement philosophy, and it would go against his morals to actually prevent Tom from reprinting it. Eventually they settled their differences and the issue is now back in print. And that's the story on why Spawn issue 10 was not reprinted in any form, collected editions included, for 14 years. Ultimately, issue 10 is a polarising book, but it doesn't have any bearing on the rest of the Spawn story, so it's not really a problem if you read one of the collected editions that it wasn't published in. Yes, it can feel a little jarring in comparison to the rest of the issues to that point, but it's a politically charged story highlighting the issues that the real-world creators faced in the creative climate at the time. It's heartfelt and evocative, and it would be a real shame if it had never seen the light of day due to a joke, a stupid misunderstanding. The final page of this issue states that the creators own the trademark and copyright for their characters forever. I think this is a nice conclusion to such an emotive issue. Okay, now we're back to our featured presentation. We're now on issue 11. I'd love to talk in detail about Frank Miller's story here, but to be honest it's my least favourite and biggest disappointment in all the Spawn series to date. I love Frank Miller's work, Sin City, 300, his work on Batman just to name a few, but this is a weak story about gangs fighting for turf in Spawn's territory. They aren't featured in any other stories outside of this issue that I'm aware of, and the art's not up to its usual standards. Sorry, but that's my opinion. If you're looking for answers, then issue 12 is for you. We've already talked.
Hey, it's Factory Supervisor Ray here. We did not approve of this overtime or use of company property for personal projects. So we're going to call it there and we will catch you guys next time. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day. Okay, bye.